As mentioned in the introduction, in 1968, I became the staff coordinator for the John Birch Society for the state of Oklahoma. Taken to Oklahoma City by my major coordinator and deposited on the streets in Oklahoma City and told to go at it and build the John Birch Society in the state, I proceeded to meet many of our members in that state and vote and work with many people over the 11 years that I spent up there. And I'm going to tell you about two of our members and what they did in the state of Oklahoma in their respective areas, because I think it exemplifies what we have done in the John Birch Society and the character and the responsibility we have shown as members. One of the members that I'm going to tell you about is Mr. Eugene Parrish. He lived in Weatherford, Oklahoma. I received a call one day after being on the staff for about 6 months by a home chapter member there in Weatherford, Oklahoma, and he asked me when I was going to be in Weatherford again. He said, "I have met a man who's a retired minister, and we have talked about the John Birch Society, and he's very concerned about the country, and he says, I'd like you to meet him." And he said, "When will you be here?" And I says, "Well, I can be here in about 2 weeks." He says, "Okay, I'll set up the appointment with you, and you call him as soon as you get into town." Well, I changed my schedule around, and I went to Weatherford, Oklahoma, and I called Mr. Parrish as soon as I arrived in town. He gave me directions how to find his home, and I drove up to his home, and there was Mr. Parrish sitting on his front porch in his swing, enjoying a warm Oklahoma day. And I introduced myself to him, and we began to talk. And he told me how he had spent over 40 years in the ministry, but yet he felt like that something was wrong in the country. He said, "The country is falling apart by its seams." And he says, "The biggest thing that bothers me is there's so many good Christian people that are doing absolutely nothing in order to preserve our freedom and our heritage and our Constitution." And he says, "It leads me to believe that the ministers of this country have failed to do their job." And he says, "I'm going to have to shoulder that blame too over the past 40 years that perhaps I have failed in my job too as a minister." He says, "I want to hear about the John Birch Society. You remember here in town when I was in his dentist's office told me about it?" And he says, "I'd like to know more. This looks like something that I need to get involved in." Well, I proceeded to tell Mr. Parrish about the society, and I asked him, I said, "Would you set up a film series for us so we could gather people together to inform them on some of the major issues facing us?" So we proceeded to make our plans, and about 3 weeks later I came back into Weatherford, Oklahoma. We had our first film showing, and Mr. Parrish had 14 people out for that first showing. Well, we proceeded in the next several weeks to show additional films, and we had a presentation on the John Birch Society, and we formed the first chapter of the John Birch Society in Weatherford, Oklahoma. Well, the chapter continued to grow. We continued to show films. And after one of the film showings, Mr. Parrish walked up to me, and he said, "Bill, what are these American opinion bookstores that you keep mentioning about in these films? I'd like to know more about that." And he said, "The reason why is I have a piece of property in front of the college here in town. It's 1 block in front of the college, and it's a building. And he says, I'd like to put one of those bookstores in there to see if I can reach some of these young people that go to this college and live in this town." Well, I explained to Mr. Parrish that it was an expensive proposition putting in a bookstore, that we at least had to have a foundation of a minimum of 5 chapters in an area in order to do it. But he informed me that the local dentist, who was a member, decided that he would help. And he says, "We have no rent or no overhead. I own the building." And he says, "I already have a little business in there anyway." So he says, "This is something I want to do. I think I can really be effective reaching these young people." Well, I gave him the information on how to set up the bookstore. He sent away to Belmont, got the material, and I went out there for the day they had the opening of the American Opinion bookstore in Weatherford, Oklahoma. And he had put a flagpole up front. All the members were gathering around, and they were taking pictures of each other. And that day, young people started coming into our bookstore. And every time I would go into Weatherford, Oklahoma, I'd stop by our bookstore to meet Mr. Parrish, and he'd be so excited. He'd come running up to me and he said, "Bill, we had a half a dozen young people come into this bookstore today." And I remember one time he came up, he had over a dozen young people that one day that came into that bookstore. And he said, some of them, of course, can't afford all the literature. And he says, of course, I give some of it away, and I cut the price on some of it to help them also. But he says, if we can reach these young people, this is the generation that's going to carry on the fight for America. And he says, we have to plant these seeds of Americanism with them. And he worked very diligently, and soon I began to notice in our film showings there in Weatherford, Oklahoma, that young people were showing up at these film showings and joining the local chapter. Well, this proceeded for about a year. One day I received a telephone call from the same dentist that originally called me. And he asked me the same question again. He says, when are you going to be back in Weatherford, Oklahoma? And I said, well, I hadn't planned on it right away. I said, why? And he says, well, Mr. Parrish has become ill. It seems like he's had a heart condition over the last 5 years and hasn't mentioned it to anybody, and he refuses to leave the bookstore, that he's afraid that he'll miss some of these young people. And he says, Bill, you need to come out and talk to him. He won't even listen to his wife now. He wants to stay there. So I changed my schedule immediately, and I drove out to Weatherford. And when I pulled out of the bookstore, I was walking up to the front door, and Mr. Parrish greeted me. And when I saw him immediately, I knew he was an ill man. He was very pale, looked very frail. And I began to talk to him, and I asked him to go for medical attention. And he said, well, Bill, he says, I just have a short time left. God has been good to me over the years. And he says, I've had this heart condition for the last 5 years. And they have given me an oxygen tank and given me some medicine to take, and that's all the doctor's going to tell me anyway. I don't have to waste my money on that. He said, but these young people that are coming here today to this bookstore, he said, I can do more by talking to them. Well, he just wouldn't listen, and I tried to prevail on him. And when I said goodbye to Mr. Parrish and I was driving away, I had this feeling that I had said goodbye to him for the last time. And about a week later, I got a phone call from his wife that Mr. Parrish had died in the bookstore the day before. And she asked me if I would come out to Weatherford and say a few words in the funeral and participate in the service. And I went out to Weatherford for the service. And after the church service, we went over to the cemetery. And when the last words of the committal service were being said, I looked around in the cemetery. It was filled with young people. Everywhere I looked, young people that Mr. Parrish had touched. And I began to realize, as a new coordinator of the John Birch Society at that time, there was more to the John Birch Society than just joining an organization. That here was the spirit of Americanism. Here was what was going to turn this country around and reestablish what our founding fathers had given us. And ladies and gentlemen, up till today, the 4 years that I have spent here in the Southeast United States, I have met 2 young people, both members of the John Birch Society, that were first introduced to the Americanist cause in the John Birch Society through that bookstore in Weatherford, Oklahoma, through the work of Mr. Parrish. The other member that I'm going to tell you about is a man named Bill Reynolds. Bill Reynolds lived in Tonkawa, Oklahoma. He was quite a unique man. He was a businessman, he was deacon in his church up there, and he later became mayor of Tonkawa, Oklahoma. He had a very good humor. I kind of likened him to the John Birch Society's Will Rogers in Oklahoma. And he could devastate a liberal with his humor, and he had a unique writing ability on using that humor also. Back in the early years, somewhere between 58 and 1960, Mr. Reynolds had come across a copy of the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, and he read it. He had never been contacted by any staff member or anything like this. And he liked what he read in the Blue Book of the John Birch Society and began to pass it around town and get other people to read it too. And he gathered these people up, and they began to discuss what Mr. Welsh was saying in the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, and they saw about forming chapters, and they didn't know what to do or how to go about it. They only had that one application blank. So Bill called our Belmont office, and he said, hey, I got 10 people down here. We're ready to go with the chapter. What do I do next? Well, at that time, Belmont was not accustomed to that type of phone call, so they immediately rushed a coordinator down there, and some of you members that were around there realized our coordinators covered a great distance at that time, and they formed the first chapter of the John Birch Society in Tonkawa, Oklahoma, under Bill Reynolds' direction. Well, shortly after that, I met Bill after I came on the staff, and I would go into Tonkawa, Oklahoma, and meet Bill at his business. And we would go across the street to the coffee shop, which was owned by one of our members, and we would sit down and discuss our upcoming activity of the John Birch Society in the area. And I soon learned that Bill had an enemy in town. It was the local postmaster. He did not like Bill Reynolds. He did not like the John Birch Society. He did not like anything that we stood for. And he constantly kept up a barrage of letters to the editors in the local paper. venting his feelings on those three subjects. In fact, the exchange of the letters of the editors between Bill Reynolds and this postmaster became the highlight of the time. Every time the paper was issued, people would stand around waiting for the paper to see the coming battle and who was going to say what next. And I'll have to say one thing for Bill. He devastated that postmaster through humor, to the point that the postmaster was reduced to name-calling and wild charges, and Bill definitely had the upper hand in that fight. Well, we continued to work in Tonkawa. We would meet at his business, go over to the coffee shop, plan our presentations and our film showings, and the chapter in Tonkawa continued to grow. And it split. And we started another chapter from the original Tonkawa chapter, a little town 15 miles away, and that continued to grow. And then both chapters split off again and started another chapter in another town about 20 miles east of there. And this all happened within a year's time. And I was really enjoying my association with Bill, because at that time he became mayor of the town also, and it opened up a lot of doors for us. Well, one day when I was going into Tonkawa, I stopped to see Bill Reynolds. And he says, well, let's go over to the coffee shop. And we were crossing the street, and I noticed Bill was limping very badly. And I looked at him and I said, well, Bill, did you hurt yourself? And he says, well, he says, it could be an injury that I received from a wound I received in the Korean War, or he said it may be worse. He says, I don't know, but I'm going to go to the doctor down in the hospital in Oklahoma City in about 2 weeks, and I'll find out. Well, about a month later, I was back in Tonkawa, and I had forgotten about what Bill had told me about the injury, and we were crossing the street again, and I noticed he was limping. And I says, oh, by the way, did you find out what was wrong with your leg? And he said, yes. He says, it's what I feared it was. And he said, and what he described to me was what we commonly call the Lou Gehrig's disease. And it's a disease that your nerve fibers and muscle fibers deteriorate over a period of time, and paralysis spreads throughout your body. In the last stages of the disease, you're totally paralyzed, and you just quietly pass on at a certain point. And he says there's different types of this disease and how it affects you. Some of it affects you very fastly. Some of it could go on for years, even decades. He said, the doctor told me, though, that I have probably 2 to 3 years. But I noticed when I was talking to Bill that his spirits seemed very high. So we went across the street, and we began to plan our future activities, what we were going to do with the upcoming speech in the area and the battle we were involved with on fighting the ERA. Well, I continued my trips into Tonkawa, working with the local chapter and with Bill. And as time progressed, I could see the disease progressing on Bill. Soon he had to have a cane to get around in, then he was in a wheelchair, and then he was confined to an easy chair and then a bed in his home. But do you know that that chapter met regularly, month for month, with Bill, even around his bed. And Bill carried on that battle with that local postmaster on defending the Americanist cause and the John Birch Society and taking the initiative in the area. I'll never forget one meeting that I went to, and I walked in Bill's living room, and they had put Bill in a easy chair, and he had lost the ability to walk at that time, and he had a stack of none-dare-call-it conspiracies on one side and blue books and other literature on the John Birch Society on the other side, and he had the biggest grin on his face. And he says, Bill, he says, you know, I have talked to more people and sold more literature and discussed the John Birch Society with more people, and they're having to come to me instead of me go to them. On one trip up there, when Bill was bedridden at that time, I went into his wife Della, and she said, you know, go talk to Bill, and he likes to hear what's happening. And he was beginning to lose his ability to speak at that time. And after our conversation with Bill, I went to his wife Della, and I says, well, Della, should I go ahead and replace Bill as chapter leader of this chapter? And she looked at me and she says, no, you know, this is what he's lived for. He's lived for three things. That's his God, his family, and his country through the John Birch Society. And he said, let him hold on to this to the end. And she said, I'll do everything I can to help him. Well, apparently she must have discussed this with him. And one of the last letters that Bill wrote, and he had developed the ability to type through using a pick in his teeth, he wrote me a letter about a week after that. And he told me what the John Birch Society had meant to him, how it had made him a better family man, a better Christian, and a better American, and how it had changed his life for him. Well, a few weeks after that, I was back in Tonkawa, and I went in to see Bill, and he had lost his ability to speak at that time, and you could only communicate to him through watching the blinking of his eyes. And Della said, "Sit down, tell him what's happening. He wants to know." So I sat there for about an hour, and I explained to Bill our recent victory we just had on defeating the ERA and for the first time in Oklahoma, and how recruitment was picking up and some of the things we were doing. And I looked down at Bill as I was talking to him, and there was tears running down his cheeks. But they were tears of happiness, because I realized when talking to Bill that he knew that we were getting the job done in the John Birch Society, and his efforts there in Tonkawa were beginning to pay off also. When I left there, Della got me to the side, and she said the doctor said it would just be a few more weeks. And about 2 weeks later, I got a phone call that Bill had died quietly in his sleep. And she asked me if I would come to Tonkawa, Oklahoma, and sit with the family and take part in the services. Well, I drove to Tonkawa, Oklahoma the day of the services. And I drove up to the First Baptist Church where Bill had served as deacon. The place was packed. There were people outside. They had set up loudspeakers outside so that people could hear the services. And when the service was over, we were filing by Bill's casket. And when I went by, I looked down, and there on his one lapel was his Christian cross, and his other lapel was his birch leaf. And we went out to the cemetery for the final committal services. And I was standing there with a member and with the family. And just as the preacher was just about ready to conclude the services, this fellow stood up, and he interrupted the services, and he was holding a brown bag. And I looked around, and it was the local postmaster. And I looked over to the member with me, and I told him, I said, if he is going to carry this battle on here, there's going to be 2 people going into that hole in the ground before this service is over with. And of course, the member grinned at me, and he says, "I'm all with you." And we started to move forward. But when we got within a few feet of the postmaster, we noticed there was tears running down his cheeks. And he walked up to Della, and he faced the crowd, and he says, "Della, I'm sorry." He said, "What I have seen through Bill Reynolds over the last 2 years, I have begun to realize what an American is." He says, "It has caused me to reevaluate my thoughts and my thinking." And he says, "I want to publicly apologize." And he says, "I have had this flag in this bag shipped down from Washington, D.C. that was flown over the Capitol, and I would like to present it to you and have it placed on Bill's casket." And of course, needless to say, there was tears running down all our cheeks at that time. But through this example of Bill Reynolds and Eugene Parrish, we have thousands upon thousands of members that we could say the same thing about. Our founding fathers gave us a heritage in this country. It's a heritage that we're building on. But here as we stand at our 25th anniversary, we have our own heritage in the John Birch Society. The Bill Reynolds, the Eugene Parrishes, the Larry McDonalds, and thousands of others. So let's remember them at this 25th anniversary celebration. And let's go forward on the next 25 years and build on less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world.